Right. Let's turn now to other big news in the tech space coming out last night. Facebook facing a lawsuit from the FTC and more than 40 states' attorneys general over its acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, those coming in 2012 and I believe 2015, respectively. And joining us now to talk a bit more about the implications here for Facebook is Matt Stoller. He's the director of research at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's also the author of the recent book, Matt, not that recent now, year-old Goliath, great book that came out last winter and talked a lot about the implications of antitrust law. And so I'd love to begin with your view on what these latest developments as it relates to Facebook's acquisition mean, just in the context of all the legal challenges and legal problems that Facebook is facing on a number of fronts. And certainly this would seem to create an additional antitrust problem for the business.
In this case, the government's really going after the crown jewels of Facebook, saying that their acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp were illegal, and essentially asking for them to be spun off to be independent competitors to the Facebook Blue, the main site.
Matt, you wrote in a new newsletter that I believe a couple hours ago, that Facebook, quote, engaged in systemic criminal behavior here. What is that what do you mean when you say that? Is that Mark Zuckerberg should be fined, should be tossed away in the slammer? How do you define that?
Well, the Sherman Act is a criminal statute as well as a civil statute. And this is a civil case. But monopolization is a crime. And what Zuckerberg was trying to do, and Facebook executives were trying to do, is they were trying to buy up their competitors and then exclude other competitors that they couldn't buy up from the market. Then they degraded the user experience and surveilled people in ways they didn't like so that they could sell more ads. It's essentially a version of theft and a power grab. And that's why monopolization is a crime. Now, I don't expect them to bring criminal charges against Mark Zuckerberg. Perhaps in a different era they would, but it's important to note that what Mark Zuckerberg did was steal a lot of money. And that's effectively what Facebook is. It is a criminal conspiracy. And that's why this case is so important, because they're saying, enough. We're not going to allow you to continue to exclude competitors, and we're not going to allow you to keep the ill-gotten loot that you got from these criminal activities years ago.
Matt, it's Julie here. I just want to take a step back because obviously you dug into a lot of these issues in your book. What is a monopoly at this point, right? And is the definition of a monopoly different than what it was when the Sherman Act was created? One would think that it is to some extent because the marketplace has changed. So, we've seen such huge changes there. So how should we be thinking about what a monopoly is at this point?
Right. It's a great question. So monopoly is the ability to fix prices in a market. It's unified control of a market. Essentially the private governing of a market by a monopolist or a small set of people. And Facebook absolutely sets that definition. They set the terms and prices for advertising and social media. It's why it's why everybody's freaking out about Zuckerberg making political choices about what we can say, because he sets the terms of a large chunk of public discourse. So, and absolutely that the idea that the Sherman Act was, high tech didn't exist in 1890 and when it was updated is kind of not true. It's just sort of an excuse for inaction that we've had. I mean, we had network systems in the 1890s and telegraphs and oil pipelines and whatnot. So the law is fine if judges would interpret it properly. And the case is solid. People in the 1890s would have recognized the case, and this is what the law was passed for. So it's amazing that this case is coming. It's coming 2 months after a similar one against Google. This is a real rethinking of the economy and how we organize our society, and it's just the beginning.
And Matt, you use the word rethinking, and that's significant because Facebook's main complaint in their retort, at least as I read it yesterday, they have a couple paragraphs in there about this is revisionist history, and how could any company trust that their acquisitions won't be unbundled in the future? But correct me if I'm wrong, but when I read your book, I sort of took it as a call to reinterpret things that have happened, and that is a way that regulators can go about changing the face of corporate power. They can just say this thing happened and it shouldn't have, therefore we're going to undo it.
Right. I mean, a corporate charter comes from the state. Most of the contract enforcement comes from the state. All of these are political choices. So the idea that FTC or states didn't take action 10 years ago is kind of irrelevant. I mean, there was plenty of evidence. The House Antitrust Subcommittee found it, and these enforcers found it, that Mark Zuckerberg was attempting to monopolize and successfully did. So it doesn't matter what happened, why those enforcers didn't act. The enforcers can act now. They have good evidence. Often, Mark Zuckerberg helpfully wrote down his intentions, and they can bring the case. And this is how we used to run the United States, really for 200 years until the early 1980s. So this is kind of a return to the way that we, to the American tradition of actually organizing our society and our economy.
Matt, and just staying on that, you do write that America has learned how to govern it again. And if that is in fact the case, what does Apple look like in 5 years? What does Facebook look like in 5 years? What happens to Google?
Yeah, I mean, I think all these companies are going to be broken up. They're too big. They're badly managed in many cases, and they are fundamentally a threat to a free society of people who can govern themselves. And so we're going to have to restructure these companies. That's not necessarily going to be bad for stockholders. Facebook will probably be worth more split apart than it is now, and same thing is true with Amazon and Google. But it's going to be good for society. I mean, right now you effectively have very little small business formation. You have rancid inequality, asset inequality, income inequality, regional inequality, political divisiveness. All of these things are a function of the concentration of power in the hands of a few, which is really a monopolization story. So this is a reaction to that monopolization problem and to the political problems that we've had for the last 10, 20 years. And we really need to deal with these social problems. And Mark Zuckerberg obviously doesn't want us to, but that's increasingly irrelevant. So that's why this is exciting.
And Matt, finally, to bring it back to Facebook specifically, as you're just talking about, I have to say, I have trouble seeing how a Facebook without Instagram and WhatsApp would necessarily, be less powerful in the marketplace, and B, solve some of the societal issues that it has grappled with that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we have to do more than just split up the company. There's a few other contractual restrictions that the states are looking for. But if you go back to, I don't have to prove to you that splitting up Facebook will solve a bunch of these problems. We know that having competition will. So part of what the complaints say is that in the early 2000s, and we remember this, there were a bunch of social networks. MySpace was the big competitor to Facebook, and Facebook actually competed with MySpace over users by saying, we're safer, we will protect your data. And they in fact let people vote on their terms of service. Once they killed their competition, then they started intrusive surveillance, and you didn't have any choice of where to go. So we know that having more competition will actually elevate privacy standards and will actually make the experience better and safer, because that's what actually users want. But Facebook isn't delivering it because they don't have to. They're a monopoly.
All right, really interesting conversation that I know will continue in the year ahead. Matt Stoller is the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. Matt, thanks so much for joining the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me.